Bucknell University professor Judith Grisel is an expert in behavioral neuroscience and addiction, an author, and someone who has also personally experienced addiction at some of its most severe levels. Earlier, my colleague sat down with Judy to discuss what exactly happens inside your body when you're binge drinking.
Can you explain a little bit about what happens in the human brain when someone is binge drinking?
Sure. Alcohol is a neurotoxin, and it starts by going all over the brain, so it's unlike some drugs in that it permeates cell membranes very readily, so it goes into every nook and cranny in the brain, and there it has lots of influences. So it slows down the excitatory signals, it speeds up the inhibitory signals, and of course all of that is dose dependent, so the more you take, the more it acts.
And does every episode of binge drinking lead to a massive loss of brain cells?
A massive loss of brain cells is sort of a relative thing. So we have so many brain cells, but binge drinking definitely kills brain cells, and probably not, I don't know if it's more or less than, say, a big head injury, but it's quite a few. Maybe more importantly is that it alters neural communication in such a way that it can change the structure and the function of the brain for a long term.
And you have also called alcohol a, quote, pharmacological sledgehammer. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, well, the pharmacological sledgehammer refers to a few things. One is that alcohol is so promiscuous as a molecule. It gets all over the brain and it interferes with all kinds of processing. It slows the release of neurotransmitter, it interferes with all kinds of signaling. So it's not having a sort of specific effect. It's not like a lever or even a little hammer. It just really disrupts a lot of brain functioning. But also it's toxic, so it does so in a way that is generally damaging to brain structures and functions.
It sounds so destructive. Is a lot of this permanent damage after binge drinking episodes, or does the body recover?
Well, the brain is plastic, so there's always some recovery, but I think there's always, depending on the dose and the intensity and the regularity of that binge drinking, it can definitely produce lasting, irrecoverable effects.
So are any of these physical and physiological effects of alcohol different? Do they present themselves differently in teens or those in their early 20s than, say, someone with a fully mature brain?
Absolutely. So the brain is always plastic. It's always adapting. It's really its best feature. But sometimes it's more plastic than others. So in early development, when you're a baby, you know, it's going crazy. And then again, between about puberty and 25, there's really this explosion in neural wiring and the circuitry being laid down. And during any period of high plasticity, when that brain activity is perturbed, it's likely to have a lasting impact. So you're exactly right that anytime you binge drink, you're going to alter the brain, probably permanently to some degree or another. The plasticity can help it recover, but the more you do this, the less likely you are to be able to sort of overcome those perturbations. But those influences during the time most people are learning to binge drink, adolescence, are likely to have lasting effects on the circuitry and the wiring of the brain and subsequent behavior.
That's so important for young people to know. I think a lot of people don't realize that. So Judy, I know that your own personal experience was a factor in leading you to become an expert in this field. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that and about your book?
No, I'd be glad to. I had my first great drink at 13. I had had little sips before that, but at 13 I got a half of a gallon of wine and had a really life-altering experience. It was in some ways the best thing I thought that ever happened to me, and looking back, maybe in some ways the worst thing. But it really was transformative because I felt suddenly like alcohol was the solution to the problems I hadn't even realized I had. I was suddenly less anxious, I felt more comfortable with myself, I wasn't so insecure or worried. and it was really fun. And I spent really the 10 years after that taking every single drug I could get, including more alcohol, but other things as well. So I really used during that plastic adolescent phase. And as a result, I ended up homeless and contracting hepatitis C from sharing dirty needles and being kicked out of 3 schools, and I lost the respect from everybody I knew, including myself. So my life was a disaster 10 years later. But that motivated me when I found out in treatment that I had a disorder that was going to kill me if I kept using, to try to understand the disorder. And that's how I became a neuroscientist eventually, and ended up writing a book, not because I have fixed addiction or anybody has, but because I think it's worth hopefully educating everybody about what's going on in the brain as addiction develops, what was different about my brain perhaps before I ever began, and how drugs and alcohol changed my brain structure to cause my self-destruction.
An amazing story. I look at you now, a complete success. It's wonderful, and thank you for sharing that with us. I think part of what you were describing gets to, I think, maybe the genesis of a lot of addictive behavior, which is, young people feeling perhaps insecure or looking for something to bolster their confidence and finding it in some substance. And then perhaps realizing that they may be genetically predisposed to addictive behavior, right? Isn't that an element in it and that you just don't know until you start whether that's the case?
Well, you're exactly right. So genetics account for about half of the risk, and you could make a guess about that based on your family history. The more alcoholics or drug addicts or even depressed or anxious people in your family, the higher your risk. But all of those things are so prevalent in our society that virtually all of us have some risk. I think in all the talks I've been giving lately, I met one person who doesn't have an alcoholic in her family out of thousands. So that's pretty rare. And I do think that the early exposure is one of the things that really contributed in my case. So, it's a complicated disorder, like most behavioral disorders, caused by a combination of genes and experiences, especially at particular times.
We do know from some, initial medical reports, obviously e-cigarettes and vaping are relatively new, but there is a generation of young people that are using them. And we do know that some doctors say e-cigarettes and vaping can lead to further addictive behaviors later on. So are you seeing any connection between the popularity or the rise of e-cigarette use and perhaps binge drinking and other addictive behavior?
Well, I think it's too early to say, but the basic studies, the animal research, the years of studying that suggest that that would be the case, that using anything sort of greases the rails for anything else. So they do all act as gateways for each other, more or less. And so I think the more accepted use is, and vaping is certainly easy and accessible, the more likely it is that we're going to see a rise.
Well, Professor Judith Grisel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching the CBSN original Drinking Culture, American Kids and the Danger of Being Cool. For more, go to cbsnews.com/drinking. And for the rest of the day's news, we'll have that after the break. CBSN, CBS News, always on.